Good evening. I'm Juan González, the co-host of Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. I'm also a senior fellow at Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I'm honored to be your moderator this evening. Since we began broadcasting Democracy Now! 28 years ago this month, ours has been one of the few U.S. media outlets that has consistently provided in-depth coverage from voices on the ground in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and the broader Middle East about the topic of tonight's webinar, War and Peace in Israel and Palestine. That's why I'm pleased we have such a terrific panel of people's advocates tonight to tackle the urgent question of building bridges for peace, for halting Israel's continuing war on Gaza. People around the world have been stunned by the tragic death and devastation this war has caused. More than 29,000 Palestinians dead, 2/3 of them women and children, more than 69,000 wounded, over half of Gaza's 2.3 million residents displaced, at least 140,000 buildings destroyed or damaged, scores of hospitals, churches, schools demolished, journalists, health personnel, and UN employees killed as they worked. No place safe for civilians to escape the constant bombs and shelling. The Labor Network for Ceasefire is a newly formed network of an unprecedented group of unions, local and national, representing over 9 million workers who have called for a ceasefire now of Israel's assault on Gaza. It took several years after the start of the illegal US invasion of Iraq, or further back during the Vietnam War, before anti-war activity in the labor movement reached the level that it has already reached in the past 4 months of the war in Gaza. Since the conflict began on October 7th, more than 230 national and local union organizations and organizations have joined the call for a ceasefire. There's never been such a widespread opposition among organized labor to a US-supported war in the 140 years since the founding of the modern American labor movement by the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, in 1886. While our leaders in Washington continue to unflinchingly back this mass slaughter, grassroots movements that have included tens of thousands of Jewish Americans have pressed their local governments to take a stand. Chicago recently became the largest city in the country to pass a city council anti-war resolution. Dozens of city councils have taken similar stands, including San Francisco, Detroit, Minneapolis, Oakland, Bridgeport, Connecticut, Atlanta, Seattle, Albany, Akron, and other cities. Altogether, 70 US cities have passed resolutions on the Israel-Gaza war, with most of them calling for a ceasefire. To explore the growing movement for peace and how we can expand it further, we'll hear from 4 widely known and respected leaders: 2 presidents of national unions, Shawn Fain of the United Auto Workers and Becky Pringle of the National Education Association. We'll also hear from 2 of the most progressive members of Congress: Rashida Tlaib of Michigan's 12th district from Detroit and Dearborn. She's the first Palestinian American to serve in the US Congress, and Summer Lee from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's 12th district. So 12 is our lucky number tonight. First, though, we'll hear from Professor Wendy Pearlman, director of Northwestern University's Middle East and North African Studies program, who is the author of 3 books on the Palestine-Israeli conflict, including Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement. Professor Pearlman will give us a short 10-minute primer on the 100 years of continued struggle in the Palestinian territories and why this could be a real turning point. But before I turn it over to Professor Pearlman, I'd like to share a short quote from the great Israeli historian and political scientist Ilan Pappé in a speech that he gave last month at the International Human Rights Commission's Genocide Memorial Day in London. And Ilan Pappé said this. He titled his talk, "It is Dark Before the Dawn." And he said, "But even in this dark moment, we should understand that settler colonial projects that disintegrate are always using the worst kind of means to try and save their project. This happened in South Africa and South Vietnam. I am not saying this as wishful thinking, and I am not saying this as a political activist. I am saying this as a scholar of Israel and Palestine with all the confidence of my scholarly qualifications. On the basis of sober professional examination, I am stating that we are witnessing the end of the Zionist project. There's no doubt about it. That was Ilan Pape speaking last month. After Professor Pearlman speaks, we'll hear from each of our speakers for about 5 to 7 minutes on why an immediate ceasefire is in the interest of labor, of the American people, and of the entire world. We'll then ask them to respond to some audience questions. Feel free while they talk to use your chat and Q&A functions to add your perspective and questions. We'll be using your responses in the Q&A to field questions at the end. So I want to turn the microphone over to Professor Wendy Pearlman.
Thank you so much. I have some slides that I'm going to share now. Okay, can everyone see the slides okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful, thank you. It is an enormous honor to be here with some of the most inspiring leaders in the US today. I could go on and on about how humbled I am, but I won't, because I have 10 minutes to cover what I usually cover in a 10-week class. So knowing that I will leave out more than I can possibly mention, I'll begin in the 19th century. After a history of anti-Semitic violence and discrimination in Europe, European Jews founded Zionism, a movement of Jewish nationalism to create a Jewish state. The Zionist movement set its sights on Palestine, an area of Ottoman Greater Syria whose population was over 90% Arab, Muslim, or Christian. Claiming Palestine because a Jewish kingdom had existed some 2,000 years prior, waves of Zionist migration arrived in Palestine and began acquiring land. From the very start, Palestinian Arabs protested that Zionism would make them strangers in their own land, the land that they had inhabited for generations. Still, in the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the British government pledged to facilitate a Jewish national home in Palestine. Britain made no recognition of Arabs' national rights or aspirations. It scarcely recognized their existence at all. The British took colonial control of Palestine in 1922. Zionist state building advanced on the ground, and so did Palestinian resistance, including a revolt and a general strike beginning in 1936. During the 6-month strike, transport facilities in the Jaffa port halted operations. Merchants and laborers stayed home, and schools and factories closed, among other acts of work stoppage, boycott, national protest, nonviolent protest, and also armed rebellion. This history reminds us the building of a state for the Jews at the expense of the indigenous Arab population of Palestine and Palestinians' refusal to accept displacement and dispossession was entrenched years before the Holocaust. In 1947, Britain ceded its mandate to the United Nations, which voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish state, which you see here in blue, and an Arab state, the land here in tan. For Palestinians, it was a historic injustice that most of their homeland would be taken from them and given to a predominantly new settler community that constituted only 30% of the population at the time. Fighting began nearly immediately. This was the 1948 war, what Palestinians call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. In the course of the war, the new state of Israel conquered territory beyond that awarded by the United Nations. That is the territory that you see here in purple that was then added to the blue to form the state of Israel. In other words, by war's end, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. About 750,000 Palestinian men, women, and children, more than half of the total Palestinian population, fled, or were expelled as refugees. Some 400 Palestinian villages in what became Israel were depopulated or destroyed. The UN recognized Palestinian refugees' right of return. Israel has refused that right until today. These images from the Nakba, refugees fleeing, living in tents, lining up for scarce food, are recurring now. And the weight of this history adds yet another level of pain to the already unimaginable nightmare in Gaza. After 1948, some Palestinians remained in Israel and became second-class citizens. Some fled to other Arab states. Some remained in or fled to the two parts of historic Palestine that remained outside Israel: the eastern part of Jerusalem and the West Bank of the Jordan River, which were annexed by Jordan, and an enclave of about 6 by 28 miles, or a bit bigger than the size of Detroit, that came to be called the Gaza Strip, which was governed by Egypt. About 80% of Gaza's population were refugees forced from homes in what became Israel. This made Gaza one of the densest places on earth. Most refugees had lost everything, but they invested in education and built communities anew. And these are the very communities that are being decimated in the current onslaught on Gaza. 1967 brought a second Arab-Israeli war. In it, Israel conquered the remaining 22% of historic Palestine, as well as Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and the Syrian Golan Heights, or all the areas in pink in this map. Another 300,000 Palestinians fled as refugees, and 1.3 million Palestinian civilians in the West Bank and Gaza came under Israeli military occupation, producing everyday degradations of the type you see in this top photo. And Israel began constructing settlements, or residences for Jewish Israeli civilians built in the occupied territories in violation of international law, as in the bottom photo. Meanwhile, Palestinian refugees in exile formed political and guerrilla groups to lead their struggle. They came together in the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And in 1987, a mass popular uprising began in the occupied territories against the Israeli occupation. This first intifada saw demonstrations, confrontations, civil disobedience, and also labor action, such as a sustained commercial strike, which you see here in the closed shops. The Intifada pushed both Israel and the PLO to negotiate, and the parties announced the Oslo peace process in 1993. The PLO recognized the state of Israel. Israel recognized the PLO as a negotiating partner, but it did not recognize Palestinian rights to land or the Palestinian right to statehood. Under the Oslo framework, Israel redeployed troops from major Palestinian towns in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and a new set of institutions called the Palestinian Authority emerged to govern in those areas. But 7 years of negotiations disappointed Israelis and Palestinians alike. After an American-born Jewish settler killed worshipers in a mosque in the West Bank town of Hebron, Hamas, a militant opposition group that had been founded in 1987, began suicide bombings inside Israel. Meanwhile, the Israeli settlement population actually doubled during the peace process years. It has doubled again since then and is accelerating today. Settlements, in addition to a system of Israeli checkpoints and Israeli-only roads built in the West Bank, turned the West Bank into the Swiss cheese map that you see here, with Palestinian communities in orange, isolated and separated by Israeli-controlled areas in purple. By the year 2000, Palestinians had lost all hope that Oslo would ever lead to a Palestinian state, and so they launched a second intifada. And there have been no serious political negotiations since that time. 5 years later, in 2005, Israel removed its settlers and its soldiers from Gaza, viewing Gaza as a demographic burden that was not worth holding on to. Nonetheless, Israel remained the occupying power over Gaza. Until today, it controls what goes in and out, who goes in and out. Israel controls the airspace. It even controls how far fishers can go out into the sea. In 2007, Hamas took over Gaza after having won the PA elections the prior year. Israel imposed a draconian blockade on Gaza, generating conditions that the UN characterized as, quote, unlivable. That blockade and Hamas's rockets against it is the context in which Israel has carried out 5 separate wars on Gaza since 2008. Today, Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip has lasted 56 years. All of this is the context before October 7th. It is the context in which we must work for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, and then must continue work for a political resolution that respects the security, dignity, and human rights of all people.
Thank you, Professor Pearlman. And I'd like to turn it now to our panelists, beginning with Becky Pringle, who is the president of the National Education Association, 3 million member union of teachers across America, and who will hopefully talk to us about why this issue is so important to her union and her members.
Hey, Juan, I'm sorry. We're going to ask Shawn to go first. If you don't mind.
I'm sorry. Okay. Well, let's go with Shawn then. Shawn Fain, president of the UAW, who's just been through an enormous and inspiring strike and contract negotiations with the big 3. And Shawn, if you could talk to us about why the UAW thinks this issue of peace in Gaza is so important to the UAW and to union members across America.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm really proud to join this call with President Pringle and Congresswoman Lee, and of course, probably one of my favorite Congress people of all time, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. I'm proud to see so many people in our labor movement standing up for what's right and standing up for humanity. I'm very proud that our union, the UAW, was one of the first to call for a ceasefire. To me, this is about being loud and clear that our fight is a fight for all of humanity. And, no matter if it's a contract campaign, and definitely in situations such as this. I've had a lot of people ask, since we signed on to the ceasefire, which we were following the leadership of the UE and several others. We've had a lot of people thank us for standing up for justice, but there's been a lot of people ask, why does a union need to speak on an issue that's so far away? And, what does an auto worker have to say about war in Gaza? And, I like to tell people, before I was ever president of the UAW, before I was a skilled trades rep, I was a UAW member working in an auto plant. And let me assure you of one thing about UAW members. The best of us don't keep quiet just because it's not our neck on the line. We don't shut up because it's not our fight, not our contract, or not our issue. We stand up for each other, and we always stand up for humanity. I've always taken a lot of inspiration from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, in my opinion, was one of the best labor leaders our country's ever seen, even if he wasn't a president of a union. 1 year to the day before Dr. King was assassinated, he gave a famous speech on the Vietnam War. And in that speech, he said, it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity of life of America today can ignore the present war. And he went on to speak of the poisoning effect war has, not just on its victims, but on its perpetrators. And, as with so many writings and sayings of Dr. King, here we are, his words echoing again today. Today we find our government backing the destruction of lives and villages, not in Vietnam, but in Gaza. And as always, we hear the boosters of war, claiming that real patriots support the bombing. But we know it in this room. There is nothing more patriotic than the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of humanity. And, so no matter where that takes you, no matter where it takes us, that is why the UAW was proud to call for a ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. And we're going to continue to press for that. Again, this is a human rights issue, and we're going to stand hand in hand, arm in arm with any of our brothers and sisters and family members, no matter where that takes us in the world. Working class people and the poor are always the ones that pay the price, for the greed and for the acts of those in power. And so we have to stand together, and we're going to be there for them. But I appreciate being able to be on this and be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear from Becky Pringle, president of the NEA, the former middle school teacher in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
That's right.
And a longtime fighter for justice.
Thank you, Juan. It's so good to be with you here in this space, Shawn. All people, no matter their religion or the language they speak or their place of birth, have a fundamental right to live free of violence and war. The horror of what Hamas terrorists did can never be justified, and we condemn their attack on civilians that led to the brutal and massive loss of life, the kidnapping of innocent people, and the shattering of so many lives. And here we are, with a death toll that is rising, a humanitarian crisis that is mounting in Gaza, leaving children and families in an increasingly deadly and desperate situation. There must be a renewed urgency in calling for a ceasefire and a resolution to this ongoing conflict that has led to inhumane violence. As an education organization, we don't pretend to be experts in war and international conflict. Our expertise is educating the children that come to our school doors, whether they are US born or refugees like the ones that have been created in Gaza. And as educators, we have a professional and moral responsibility to teach and model inclusion and respect for differences. And we must speak out against injustice and violence toward innocent people, especially children. These values are as true now as they were in the 1940s when NEA supported the creation of the United Nations and participated in the formulation of UNESCO, and in 1993 when NEA helped create Education International, our global union federation of education unions. NEA has always understood that education is an international enterprise. A nation that truly values education, values the future, and values peace. So, what are we, the NEA, doing about this crisis? Just a few weeks ago, our NEA Board of Directors reaffirmed NEA's early call for ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the release of all hostages, and the immediate and full humanitarian aid to Gaza. We are expanding our efforts to influence US officials and international leaders to join us in our call. So we have greater collective power, that's what unions do, to help influence an end to this conflict and this humanitarian crisis. We are encouraging our members and our allies to lobby elected officials to support a ceasefire agreement between Hamas and Israel, provide increased US and international aid to meet the scale of the humanitarian crisis for those in Gaza and those displaced from Gaza. Of course, a release of Israeli and American and other hostages and diplomacy measures that support a two-state solution where both Israelis and Palestinians can each have safe places to call home. We are continuing our work with Education International as we advocate for short and long-term solutions that could help bring about that lasting peace to secure homelands and a quality education for the children of Palestine and Israel. And we're working with the eye to raise funds, and we hope you will join us in that effort. We're working specifically with our affiliate in Palestine to help displaced and orphaned children who rely on school and educators as that stabilizing refuge. We are helping our members to speak up, looking at this not new, but this dangerous rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry and violence in schools and campuses across the US because of this war. And we are providing professional development to help our educators learn more and to design and implement a healing-centered learning environment for our students based on best practices to help address trauma. And then finally, we know that to do this work abroad, we must have a democracy here at home. We understand that we must hold both of these things, the fight for peace as we hold the fight for our democracy. It's why I've been telling our members, we have to win all the things. We have to win all the things, including the re-election of President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, their commitment to a long-term peace that supports a two-state solution where both Israelis and Palestinians can each have safe places to call home is absolutely critical to our work ahead. And a strong labor movement is part of that work. If we are not strong, we cannot continue our racial and social justice movement, not only abroad, but here at home. We know that the alternative will diminish both our democracy and our hope for a lasting peace. The members of the NEA are committed to doing both of those things because we know we must.
Well, thank you, NEA President Becky Pringle. We're now going to hear from Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman from Michigan, the first Palestinian American in Congress, and someone who has been a target by many of the reactionary forces in our country, especially ever since she got elected, but especially in the recent months. And so this is a extremely personal issue to the Congresswoman.
No, thank you so much, Juan. I actually feel like I'm joining the ranks of Becky and Shawn in having the right enemies, I think. Those that don't want to save lives, don't want people to have human dignity, human rights. So I feel so honored and privileged to be among some incredible, incredible labor leaders with the amount of courage that you all have and listening to your membership. Even when it can be very difficult, you have listened to them and helped, guide much of what they believe in the decision you have made and supporting a ceasefire. So thank you. Thank you so much for your courage to stand on the right side of history. I know you will feel it year after year that you did the right thing, and thank you so much. You all know I am the only Palestinian American serving in Congress, but what many of my colleagues, many of you know, but many of my colleagues in Congress forget is I was also born and raised in Detroit, the home of the UAW, the most beautiful, blackest city in our country, where I learned to speak truth to power, even if my voice shakes. You know, Detroiter and activist Grace Lee Boggs taught me early on that transformative change does not happen from the people in power. It does not come from who's in Congress or who's in the White House, y'all. Transformative change comes from all of you, the people. It comes from all of us. During the civil rights movement, when many of my Black neighbors were experiencing dehumanizing racism, again, still are, but much of the civil rights movement, and people protested, they marched, they boycotted, they took to the streets because the President of the United States didn't wake up one day and say, you know what, we got to pass the Civil Rights Act, or say, you know what, segregation is inhumane, it's unjust. It was because people came together of all different walks of life and demanded that change. Even in the labor movement, we all know when workers were fed up with exploitation, with corporate greed, and decided to organize unions to fight back, they organized, they went on strike. Many lost their lives. I mean, literally in my backyard of my district, I watched images after images of men and women putting their bodies on the line so that they can have human dignity. And they withheld their labor and they demanded it and got it done. It worked. And it continues to work today, as all of you know, in fighting against injustices in the workplace. And even when I think of moments like when we got the Clean Air Act, which is so important to my district, you know, many of my communities are literally surrounded by corporate pollution. It was labor movement. It was AFL-CIO who created momentum, who supported the Clean Air Act to finally create a pathway to hold corporate polluters accountable. So you all have the power. Your membership base, your grassroots effort is what can change and transform our country. So never underestimate the power of the collective action and solidarity. We must save lives, y'all, no matter faith or ethnicity. We have to say it that way because with many of my colleagues and many of those in power, they forget that. We have to save lives, no matter faith, no matter ethnicities. And it's Palestinians right now that deserve to live too. They deserve their children to grow old too. So remember that our government has always been an institution that responds to the outside pressure. We are grateful to all of our union leaders, the membership, and demanding that their elected leaders act with urgency to save lives. We must pursue peace and diplomacy over war, y'all. I know many Americans, the majority right now, are with us. The majority of Americans who support a ceasefire, it's 53% alone, just as all of Michigan residents support a ceasefire, according to a new poll, along with 74% of Democrats in Michigan and 64% of independents support a ceasefire. Even if Congress refuses to admit it, the majority of them, they cannot silence the voices that you all represent. We now have 69 members of Congress calling for a ceasefire, and that is because of all of your efforts. The American people are demanding to be heard. Across our country, workers are walking off the job in solidarity with Palestinian human rights, and it's inspiring. We are reminded once again that there's power in withholding our labor. Our movement for a ceasefire is growing every single day, as you all know. We now have unions representing 9 million workers, forming the National Labor Network for Ceasefire, including UAW, the American Postal Workers Union, one of the first to come out, National Nurses United, International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, National Education Association, and 200 other local unions and labor groups have now said we must demand a ceasefire. I'm so grateful for each and every one of your voices in this movement, and so again, proud to be here. It's so surreal, again, watching my father's union and watching many of the people that raised me, my teachers, union coming out and supporting something that again will save lives. You all know we will not be silenced. We will not stop marching. We will not stop demanding that President Biden facilitates a lasting ceasefire and the release of all hostages and those arbitrarily detained by Israel. So thank you again, all of you, so much for your incredible courage. Thank you. Thank you for choosing that we must support life, not death.
Thank you, Congresswoman Tlaib. And we also have with us from the great state of Pennsylvania, where I lived for many years, Congresswoman Summer Lee from Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh area, to talk to us about why this ceasefire in Gaza is so important to her constituents and to the American people and labor movement in general.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you so much for having me here with you all today. I can't say how grateful I am and how inspired I am to be here with our sisters and brothers in labor who we don't take for granted the amount of courage that it takes to join in this global call for a just and a lasting peace. And as someone who has, I'm grateful for the courage of folks who came before me, Rashida Tlaib, my sister in service here, who's really and truly laid a pathway. When we think about the courage that it takes to take a stance like this, I think the labor movement exemplifies this. And I think that the labor movement has throughout history served as an example of what true solidarity looks like. It served as an example of what it looks like to sometimes have to figure our way out through situations that maybe we didn't expect to find ourselves in. And in that way, I think I'm very much like so many of your members across this nation and so many of even my constituents. When I ran for Congress, it was never because I thought that I would have or share or need a platform to talk about a just and a lasting peace somewhere else in the world. I didn't come to this conflict, and I haven't come to this stance as somebody who grew up in it or talked about it in my everyday life. Like so many of your members who didn't get a union card because they believed that they would be weighing in on wars and conflicts abroad. But what we know, what this movement knows and understands more than any other movement or as much as so many of our movements for peace, for justice, for human rights, is that when we're called, we have to show up. And this is a moment that calls and demands each and every one of us to show our courage and to live and walk in our values right now. This isn't a time that any of us can afford to cower, even as we see so many forces that would call us to stand down or would call us to maybe not take the most courageous stance. I'm here tonight to say, and because we know that a just and lasting peace has always been something that's worth fighting for. As Rep. Tlaib just said, we come from a tradition here in our country through our labor movement, through our civil rights movement, through so many of our other movements where we have had to fight, where we've had to march, where we've had to organize, and where we faced opposition that sometimes seemed insurmountable. But we showed up every day in those movements because a just and a lasting peace, justice, humanity has been worth fighting for. So it is right now. Right now, and Rashida talked about it, when we first started this months ago, it was such a small group of people who were willing to speak out, even a smaller group of people who actually had the language to do it with any expertise. There were so many incentives to not join into this fight. And when we first introduced the ceasefire now resolution, very shortly after the indiscriminate bombing started to happen in Gaza that many of us predicted would come, there weren't very many people who were willing to join us. We would talk to some of our colleagues who share all of the same values that we do, or they at least say and they express that they share these values, the progressive values that we have, that we came to Congress to hold up, the values that we told our constituents that we would fight for. But in the face of this particular conflict, there was silence. When we introduced the resolution, there were people who all over within our own caucus, within our government, within the news media who called us names and told us that we were on the wrong path, but we had to know that the just and lasting peace was worth fighting for. And we introduced it even though it was just maybe 9 of us to start with and mostly women of color. But we put it out there and we started to use the language that we were helping each other to form, to speak out in a counter narrative to what is possible, that ours is a movement not of injustice, not of war, not of terrorism, but instead ours is a movement of peace. Ours is a movement of human rights. Ours is the movement, the coalition that is talking about not just the now, but the future for all people in the region, all the peoples of our world who are impacted by this conflict. And then we gave permission for more people to come. I want you all to know, to all our siblings in labor, that because you are standing out right now, you are giving more people the language and the permission to join into this fight. So many people who have looked at the news, who've seen the images that have come down from the destruction. We've heard from our teachers. We will hear from nurses and doctors and medical professionals who will have lived experiences and have a connection to the images they've seen of hospitals under siege, of our journalists, of our writers who have seen journalists under siege in the press. Those are values that we share here in the United States that we promise to uphold. So this stance right now is so critical and it's so important. You are creating an example for so many more people who will join us because of your leadership. So I want to thank you all so much for your leadership. Thank you all for the work that you're doing, for your courage, for speaking out, for the platform that you're creating for your membership, and also for being responsive to your membership. I know that this isn't easy, as no movement has been. No pro-peace movement has been easier. But what solidarity teaches us is that when we fight, we win, and that when we do these things together, we win together. So thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Summer Lee. And I'm going to begin with some questions that have been sent in, and also those of you who want to use the Q&A to send in some questions. We're only going to have a limited amount of time, but We want to hear all your questions as well. I want to start with a question from Jean Ross, who's a registered nurse and president of the National Nurses United, one of the key organizations that is part of the National Labor Network for Ceasefire. She wants to express her appreciation for Representative Lee and Tlaib and their ongoing commitment to the issue of health and safety of our nurses and communities. And she says, as nurses, we know you can't put a Band-Aid on a bleeding wound, which is why it is so essential for labor to unite behind a call for immediate ceasefire. Can one or two of the people on the panel talk about why an immediate ceasefire rather than what we hear a lot in the news, a humanitarian pause or other temporary measures is what's needed right now to avoid the public health catastrophe that is besetting Gaza? Any one of the panelists who wants to step forward?
You want to go, Summer?
Yeah, I'll go. I mean, mostly because it dovetails what I was just trying to say at the end of that. When we think about the sheer level of destruction that we've seen in Gaza, it is so important that we recognize how unprecedented this is. And for those of us who, of course, are not on the ground and cannot be on the ground, it can be hard to put, it can be hard to measure, hard to conceive. But we're talking about in just a short span of 4 months, the total destruction of all the universities in the Gaza Strip, hospitals up from the north to the south, that, or if they are functioning at all, not nearly at the level that they need to be. We're talking about of the 2.3 million people in Gaza, 1.9 or 2 million of them are now displaced. That these indiscriminate bombings have targeted civilian infrastructure, homes and schools, churches and mosques, the cultural center of Gaza. All of these things have been destroyed, if not impacted. If we're not talking about a permanent ceasefire, then we aren't committing ourselves, to truly the task that it will take of restoring of Gaza, but also of just stopping the death. That is the first thing that we must do. We must stop. Even as we talk about the hostage release, it's important to recognize that because of the indiscriminate bombings, there have been hostages that have died, just like there have been innocent men, women, and children, nurses, and healthcare workers, and press workers, UN aid workers who have all been killed in this. This is unlike anything that we've seen in war times. So we need a response that meets the measure, the scope, the urgency of this moment. We are going to have years, maybe even decades of rebuilding that's going to have to come after this. The infrastructure of Gaza, of Palestine right now, from our hospitals to schools, there is no normalcy there. If we're talking about a humanitarian pause, what we're saying is to stop bombing kids for 20 minutes so that we can give them a Band-Aid. They don't need Band-Aids. And we also can't afford to give Israel bombs anymore. We have to completely stop the bleeding before we can start to actually rebuild and renew. So anything short of a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, doesn't offer the commitment to stopping the civilian casualties that we're seeing. It doesn't offer a commitment to allowing the flow of humanitarian aid that is now critical, as we are seeing famine, as we're seeing disease, as we are seeing people whose loved ones are dying from the water being poisoned. So anything short isn't going to meet this moment right now, but also it does nothing to get us closer to the peace that is going to create safety for everybody in the region. It does nothing to stop folks who are now becoming orphaned or disabled. We have to stop it.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in another question. This is from John O'Connor, who's a member of the American Federation of Musicians, Local 1000. He says, what is the best message to give to our trade union comrades to explain why this is labor's fight? And maybe, Shawn, you might want to tackle that one.
Boy, that's a tough one. Let me, this is a simple one for me. I mean, Actually, we just had our executive board meeting this week, and I talked about one of my favorite quotes ever. And it was from 1963 from Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he stated, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And that's, to me, as a labor union, we have an obligation to lead the movement for social and economic justice, to fight for all of humanity. That is our obligation. And, I say this often. I'll look inwardly at the UAW, and that's why I'm sitting here right now as president. I had a lot of frustration with where our union hadn't taken stances in decades and hadn't really fought in decades. And those days are finished for us. And so I just, as labor leaders, as labor union members, we have to lead. It is our obligation. And I can't put it any more clear than that. And Dr. King was speaking, about the civil rights movement in America back then, when he spoke about an injustice anywhere as a threat to justice everywhere. But I look at even the issue at the southern border here, and it's no different. I mean, these are destitute, desperate people trying to find a better life. They're not our enemy. And it's the same situation in Gaza right now. It's a humanity issue. This is about human beings being sacrificed, and we have to stop it. So, but as labor unions, this is our fight.
Yeah,
And
well, look,
Juan,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to add that, it's part of our DNA as a labor movement. It's part of our core values is solidarity. But we have to think of solidarity as an action. And so when I think about it that way, then it is our responsibility to not just lift up our voices, but to take action. And I think about, when you asked that question, what came into my mind was the words of Gwendolyn Brooks, the African-American poet. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. So in this moment, when we say every student, we have to demonstrate that we mean every student. When we say every working family, everyone has that right to freedom and fairness and equality and justice. This is that moment that we have to demonstrate that we mean every. That is a core value of unionism.
Okay, I'd like to get in one more question here from John Braxton, who's with the Veterans and Labor for Sensible Priorities. And he has this question specifically for Congresswoman Tlaib. And in particular, he says, you are a co-sponsor of the People Over the Pentagon Act, H.R. 1134, which would cut military spending by $100 billion per year to fund programs that meet urgent social needs. Could you talk about this whole issue of the war machine that only seems to get bigger and bigger, and we keep finding more wars to spend the taxpayers' dollars of the United States on instead of social needs?
No, thank you so much, Juan. And thank you, John, for this question. I think it's incredibly important because I think it's one of the reasons that many of the members within the UAW and within NEA continue to bring up. I know my constituents do all the time about this just bloated $886 billion Pentagon budget to fund bombs and weapons and war crimes, no questions asked. And we still don't have clean drinking water in majority of my schools in my district. We are literally struggling every single day to address the fact that we have a broken healthcare system that is literally profit driven from sick care rather than true healthcare. So many of my teachers right now, I supported a bill to raise at least like $60,000 beginning salary for our teachers around the country. Right now I have teachers that leave their job at 3 o'clock and are at their second job. I mean, all of this is that fact that we're struggling so much here at home. But I think it's important for everyone listening that last November, the Pentagon failed their 6th audit in a row. This is so important. You talk about transparency and wasteful spending. I mean, right now, this is so incredibly important. The other really important bill that I also put into effect, because Representative Barbara Lee is leading this fight with People Over the Pentagon Act. But I also introduced Stop Politicians Profiting from War Act to ban members in Congress and their families from trading defense stocks. This is so important. because every bomb that falls on children of Gaza right now, somebody is making money in Congress. Every time they press that yes button, they actually make money. This is incredibly inhumane and just immoral. Many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have said we needed to stop this a long time ago. It is really sick that many of my colleagues, again, profit off of the war crimes that are being committed in Gaza. And again, record profits. Many of these defense contractors are seeing just a tremendous increase in their stock profit. And again, my colleagues in Congress that get to vote on this budget, get to vote whether or not we continue to support, again, the war crimes that are happening in Gaza right now, again, profit off of that. And it's so important to also fill out, the defense contractors right now that many of my colleagues are invested in. Many of them make, direct campaign contributions to many of my colleagues. These are folks that literally benefit the more we go at war. I mean, majority of Americans are so sick of the endless wars, y'all. When they think of Gaza, they're not only they're thinking of the 3 service members we lost in Jordan. They think about the fact that 20 of our service members were injured in that. I mean, that it's expanding and hurting us directly, but also the fact that we think that this is going to lead to even a longer war, a longer, again, investment, because right now we are the #1 funder. So it is important to know, I mean, I want to go beyond the people over the Pentagon Act. We need them to pass to pass one of their audits. Again, when I think about the struggles and the challenges for my community, I just left at UAW Local 600 in my district. We had a big event there with residents talking about the fact that when they get the power outages, all their food, it gets wasteful, hearing their struggles that when their medication is gone, they don't have another $65 in their pocket to go and get their asthma, their insulin and other medications. And I heard her, I mean, she teared up, just the sense of the fact that she doesn't have human dignity. Again, our residents should be able to not only survive, but thrive in our country. And I really think the key of trying to fund the things that many of our members in labor and other places around the country right now are demanding is, I think, where we can find that money and those resources is in the Pentagon budget.
Well, thank you. And I think we're running out of time. I just wanted to remind people that there were 500 people, at least, who were on this, have been on this webinar, that it's necessary to duplicate and triple and quadruple these numbers of organizers, that you need to contact your congressional and state reps with this message. You got to reach out to other locals in your international union to encourage them to support ceasefire now, if they aren't already on record, and that you've got to reach out to other locals and other unions in your state and area and the local AFL-CIO bodies. Keep the pressure on. And I want to thank the participants in the panel, again, Professor Wendy Pearlman, for a fantastic 10-minute summary of a very complex problem, to Becky Pringle, president of NEA, Shawn Fain, president of the UAW, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and Congresswoman Summer Lee. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Spread the word, ceasefire now.